Sups, everybody! I am Mr. Sups, and we are back with another homework for Evolution of Video Games. So in the last class we discussed Sega's woes and Sony's success, and here we're discussing the continuation of that generation of gaming. And that starts with the Nintendo 64. Now, if you remember, the Nintendo 64 was originally called the Ultra 64, and it was going to come out around the same time as the PlayStation, but it got delayed, and in 1996, it came out in North America as just the Nintendo 64. So how did the Nintendo 64 kind of compete in that generation? Now, Sony made big waves making their console relatively cheap to the competition at $299. Nintendo responded by making the N64 $250. Sony responded in kind by making it $199. And you just kind of see this kind of stuff happen. The two people just kind of like kept trying to undercut the other one, and generally, consumers benefited, which is something that happens today. Like in this generation, the Xbox One was $500 and the PlayStation 4 was $400, now the Xbox One is $350, etc. Now this was mainly in terms of the consoles, so how did the games fare? Well, Sony had hit after hit after hit with games like Final Fantasy VII and Crash Bandicoot and Spyro and stuff like that. Nintendo had a less amount of hits, but the hits were harder. Nintendo had games like Star Fox and Pilot Wings and Smash Bros. And Zelda Ocarina of Time, and more importantly, Super Mario 64. Now, Super Mario 64 came bundled in with the... Now, Super Mario 64 launched with the console, so it was pretty big, but it was also one of the first games to be fully 3D, platformy, theme parkness sort of things. In fact, Shigeru Miyamoto said that a theme park was kind of the inspiration for it. You walk around as you please, and the various individual levels kind of have like rides. In fact, there are sort of rides in there, like the penguin sliding thing. Overall, it was just good. Very, very successful. And our professor, who has a background in film, compared it to Jurassic Park. It is the Jurassic Park of video game in his eyes, Super Mario 64. And if you know anything about your film history, Jurassic Park is very, very important. And you know what? He is right! Because that kind of kicked off an entire sort of way of thinking in the video game industry that everyone just kind of followed and tried to learn from. It was a paradigm shift. Yeah, call back. But that wasn't the only big thing to happen with the Nintendo 64 and really just Nintendo as a whole in this sort of era. Another thing that happened was GoldenEye. Everyone remembers GoldenEye. Pretty much the prime example of local 4-player multiplayer. Probably like the first major FPS on a console. Again, really good. Massive success. But that wasn't the only thing that was really important, because it was a very violent game. When you shot people, they bled. And that kind of stuff is very sort of alien to Nintendo, and it really did sort of help shed the whole kiddiness to more familyness, I would say. Those are very nebulous terms, but it's kind of true going on. But there was something else going on with Nintendo. They had the Game Boy, which was showing its age. It was still a big success because it had games like Tetris and like Mario Land and stuff like that, but still, it was kind of cooling off. And then they introduced to what my professor called the video game equivalent of crack cocaine. We know it, we love it, it's Pokemon. Pokemon single-handedly revived the Game Boy and continues to pull along Nintendo's handheld line to this day. It is still like this multi-million or billion, I'm not even sure, just massive dollar franchise. And I love it. I love it so much. But there's other things that we have to talk about, because there was other developments going on. Like Sega. They're still kind of bad right now. They were just losing money and losing people left and right. And at this point, around like the 1998-99 era, they had a completely new management, but they had a little something.
Yes, it is.
A little something back in their pocket. A little dream of success that they could just cast upon the world. It was the Sega Dreamcast, which was very powerful. Supporting like 3 million polygons per second, had like broadband support, had a lot of really good, really interesting games, and then it was just beaten to hell by Sony with the PlayStation 2 about a year later, kind of trumping those numbers of polygon by about 2,000% at like 60 million. It could also play movies and was backwards compatible. It just continuing the trend of Sony just shaking the carcass of Sega. It was nasty. And speaking of New Horizon or Last Hurrah type stuff, we have a very small but very noticeable revival in the arcades at this point. And in 1997, Spielberg partnered with EA to try to do just that. They kind of redesigned how arcades were going to be. They kind of designed it like a movie set with sort of experiences that you really couldn't get anywhere else but in the arcades. Like, that's where you get like the whole sort of moving couch style things, like the full motorcycle type of controller type things that were happening. And it leads to things like David Buster's and other sort of things like that. It doesn't really become massively huge like arcades were, but it is still noticeable. However, speaking of massively huge, there was a little something coming on the horizon around the 2000s, and that was the Microsoft Xbox. It started development back in 1999, and it really just started as essentially a side project by a couple guys at Microsoft that really just kind of picked up some steam. As a console, the Xbox can be seen as essentially like a super-powered sort of PlayStation 2. It had a lot of similar features. In fact, a lot of the PlayStation 2's successes directly influences the development of the Xbox. But one of the main sort of things about the Xbox, the thing that kind of made it very welcoming, let's say, was that its operating system was essentially a stripped-down version of Windows, and it could connect to the internet and stuff like that. That kind of opened up a lot of avenues for a lot of people, which really got people on board. It was kind of a modest success, but that's where we stop. And we're not even going to get to the GameCube here, because that's going to be for next class, along with how the Xbox, PlayStation 2, and GameCube are going to all hash it out. However, in the meantime, we have things to discuss. And in class, we had a discussion about education in video game, which is an old subject. It's been kind of trying to work itself out since video games began, since we kind of saw how kids would just absorb video games more than they would do learning. In fact, I bring up Pokemon and that crack cocaine. I know more about Pokemon and its mechanics than I do about US history and math. It's kind of sad. And with that, we were kind of tasked to discuss this with an article. Again, PDF, flashing on the screen. And it's essentially talking about how games have and can help kids learn. And we were supposed to find an educational game and sort of look at it with the context of the article, with its theories and all that stuff. So, the game I chose is the game I'm playing right now. Assassin's Creed. More of the series as a whole, rather than just one game in it, because Assassin's Creed 2 is just the only one I have. Now, as you know, the Assassin's Creed franchise is where you play as multiple members of a group called the Assassins, fighting a group called the Templars, vying for control over humanity's fate of the world or something. I'm not really sure. The overall myth arc is not something that really interests me. In fact, the games don't really interest me. But I do respect the franchise because I find it to be one of the most educational games in the AAA gaming space. Mostly because of the settings that they choose. Now, most games are set in things like World War II or medieval England and stuff like that. Assassin's Creed takes place in very underutilized settings, like the Crusades, the Renaissance, the American Revolution, and they recently released a game where you go into revolutionary France. And a great deal of love is put into those settings. Like, they put a lot of detail, and a lot of it is rather historically accurate. not just graphically, but historically as well. Many of the places you go and many of the people you encounter are actually somewhat accurate. While they're heavily dramatized for gameplay and narrative reasons and such, it happens. But through that lens, many people learn about those settings and those people through these games. Speaking anecdotally as the son of a teacher, many students have credited Assassin's Creed 3 for their knowledge and interest in the American Revolution. However, while there is a lot of historical learning to be had in the Assassin's Creed series, that's not the prime focus. It's more flavor for those interested. And while the article goes into various teaching methods and like reinforcement and all that, Assassin's Creed doesn't do that. There's little instruction about the historical period, and it doesn't really enforce a lot of it with like tests and quizzes and stuff like that. You don't need to learn about the history to complete the game. You just need to be immersed in it. And that's where Assassin's Creed kind of shines, because as a game, you have to live it. You have to do it. Your actions cause the history to happen, which is an advantage that games have over movies and books and a lot of stuff like that. And that's something that the article talks about with video games. That is their advantage over a lot of other medium. And again, that's what I respect about Assassin's Creed. In fact, that is one of the core principles of Assassin's Creed, with the whole myth arc about the Animus and whatnot. Again, I don't play a lot of Assassin's Creed. But in Assassin's Creed, you don't just hear about the tensions with the various powers of Renaissance Italy. You get to live them. You get to see the power of the Medici and the Church in action rather than hearing about it. And sometimes you are that action, which is great. But looking at the article, it goes into a lot of things about assessment and feedback, and with that kind of stuff, Assassin's Creed just don't work as a learning tool. And I will admit, I would be very concerned if someone's knowledge on the French Revolution, like the whole of their knowledge, comes from Assassin's Creed Unity. Because the series is entertainment seasoned with education rather than the other way around. But the series still serves as an excellent gateway for people to be interested in those subjects. The same way that Jurassic Park sparked the minds of future paleontologists out there. Assassin's Creed may be that for a future historian. But no, seriously, Mario 64 is the Jurassic Park of gaming, not Assassin's Creed.